I have spoken about the cashless welfare card in this place on a number of occasions. I have taken the time to visit the trial sites of Ceduna and with my Centre Alliance colleague Sterling Griff also met many participants as well as organisations and the police in the trial site at Harvey Bay. I think it's fair to say that there's mixed views across all 4 trial sites and particularly the 2 that I met. Now this bill before us seeks to make permanent the card in its current sites. It also seeks to transition people in the Northern Territory and in Queensland from the basics card that they're on to the cashless debit card, and it intends to expand the card as well as making permanent at any location at the Minister's discretion across Australia. One thing that I will say is that this card has been targeted at working age payments. I have received a lot of emails from really concerned pensioners, and there's a lot of myth out there, as there often is with pieces of legislation, that this potential piece of legislation would, or indeed any piece of legislation around the cashless welfare card, would transition pensioners onto the cashless welfare card, and that is fundamentally incorrect from what has been presented to us. So first of all, I think we need to look at what is the purpose of the cashless welfare card. In principle, it's designed to assist people to make positive choices with the spending of working age Centrelink payments to limit the amount of discretionary spending on alcohol and gambling. And the card's divided so that 80% of it is 80% of a Centrelink payment is put on the card, as well as any lump sum payments, and 20% of it is placed in a person's bank account. I think it's important that we acknowledge in this place that not everyone who is on a working age Centrelink payment is spending money on alcohol or gambling. These isolated sites were chosen so that thorough research could be undertaken to determine whether the implementation of a cashless debit card had an overall positive or negative effect on the individual and indeed the community. The challenge before us today is that despite the trials being established for some years now, and albeit a much shorter time in Harvey Bay, the University of Adelaide report that was set to look at the efficacy of the card in Ceduna and the Goldfields and indeed the Kimberley region hasn't been released. Now, this report was expected to be released, from memory, I think at least a year ago. So to make this card permanent in those 4 locations, as well as potentially anywhere else in Australia, is quite a significant step in the social services policy area, and we're doing this without seeing any evidence, well, certainly the evidence that the government has paid for from the University of Adelaide. Now, in the previous parliament, I was part of the Select Committee on Intergenerational Welfare Dependence. The committee's chair, the member for Monash, in his forward, he noted that causes of entrenched disadvantage are complex, and that is true. And I would say that entrenched disadvantage cannot be remedied through a card alone, and if we really want to address disadvantage, we need to work long-term with the whole of the family, ensure that there are training and job opportunities there, as well as for people who have various addictions, for there to be pathways for them to address that. And I still ask the government, I mean, that committee report was tabled in February 2019, and I asked the government, please look at the recommendations and let's implement some of the recommendations. The work of the committee was very good and should not just be filed away to gather dust. It was a good report. But without the release of the University of Adelaide report, the decision-making for Centre Alliance with respect to this bill, we can only look at our own anecdotal evidence that we gathered at Ceduna and indeed at Harvey Bay. Ceduna was the first community that I went and visited, and I visited them in September 2019. I met with a number of organisations and participants on the card, including the Ceduna Day Centre, the District Council of Ceduna, Red Cross. I visited the town camp and the Sobering Up unit. And I did, of course, speak with a number of residents who were on the card. The results in Ceduna that I could gather, I would say, would be mixed. If you talk to the District Council of Ceduna, they say the card that has been transformational in their community. They say that it's reduced public drunkenness and antisocial behaviour and has actually increased tourism in the area. These are really good points. The Ceduna Day Centre said there hasn't been a lot of difference and that people get around the card by buying goods at the local store and then trying to sell them off for cash to tourists or people who live in the town so that they can then buy alcohol. With respect to participants, I spoke that some were in favour of the card. Some felt that their personal rights were impacted upon, some were ambivalent and said that the card had not really affected their day-to-day life choices. When the card was first introduced in Ceduna, there was a commitment to provide a range of social services for people to address barriers to employment. To this day, Ceduna is still waiting for residential alcohol rehabilitation centres, any kind of service. All they have is a sobering up unit. People go in there when they are very, very drunk. When they are able to leave, they just check themselves out. But there is no rehabilitation services in Ceduna, or indeed for several hours outside of Ceduna. Yesterday, I checked on the TAFE website. For Ceduna, there is not one single course available. There is not a Certificate 1, there is not a white card, there is not a forklift licence, there is nothing. The community of Ceduna has been calling for residential rehab facilities for a long time. They are still waiting. If we are saying to people the best chance of you gaining employment is to gain qualifications, to become job ready, I think it's incumbent upon government, and in this case the state government, to work with the federal government to ensure that there are courses available where the cards are located. And for Ceduna it would be really quite simple. Look at what's there: tourism, hospitality. There's no availability for a person living in Ceduna to undertake a Certificate 1, 2 or 3 in care. And yet when I was there and I went into the local employment agency, there were vacancies on the board for people who could be care attendants. But how do you get to be a care attendant if you can't do the course? I've also visited the community of Hervey Bay with my colleague Senator Sterling Griffin in November last year, when I met with a number of organisations there as well, including the police. We held a roundtable at the end of the day with participants. Now look, I'm very grateful for everybody who gave their time, and it must be quite exhausting in these trial sites to have members of Parliament as well as other people who are undertaking research to come and constantly ask questions about how the program's going. What we saw in Hervey Bay is that when we talked to police, they were very supportive of the card. Initially, they were worried that there was going to be a rise in theft, particularly at outlets that sold alcohol. That wasn't seen. At the time when I went to Hinkler, the card was relatively new. I was there in November last year. COVID, unfortunately, has prevented me from returning there, although I would like to see how the card is developed in the area. I think it's fair to say that the police, the Queensland Police, were keen for the card to continue. I met with members of St Vincent de Paul. I met with a number of other organisations. They, at the time, felt that the card should continue because they think that it needed a longer time to bed in to see whether it actually worked. I met with We Care too. They provide emergency food relief. They have a supermarket with very low-cost food in it, and they said that there'd been a significant increase in people purchasing the food at the supermarket. Again, that is, you would think anecdotally that is a very good outcome, but again, we just don't have the evidence that has been commissioned by government, and so again I would urge the government to release that report. We did hear from participants who were concerned that the card had failed them in supermarkets. I understand over that time that many of those sort of teething issues have been addressed. People were also concerned. Initially, the card had the word "indue" on it, and people felt that that was discriminatory, and they were anxious about having a card with "indue." Again, I understand that the "indue" word has been removed, and it's a grey credit card, just like many grey credit cards. But the great challenge we have is that the government has not presented the evidence. Now, when you are looking at making something permanent, I think that the Parliament has a right to see what evidence was used to create that. And we just haven't seen that as yet. Now, I think that every person in this place would want to live in a society. In fact, I think everyone across the community wants to live in a society where people have every opportunity to transition from Centrelink, from welfare into employment. But we need to make sure that we are there standing with people, working with people to make that transition. And that means ensuring that there's educational opportunities, that means ensuring that there's access to rehabilitation, and we just don't have that yet in those places. I'll touch briefly with respect to remote Aboriginal communities who are facing the transition from Basics Card to CDC. Quite simply, I don't think the government's done the homework there yet. I know that COVID has made it a challenge, but I think at this stage, without proper consultation, and also with the fact that remote communities do not have the internet connectivity that the card really does require if you need to check your balances, I don't think that the government should be moving people in the Northern Territory, in North Queensland over. It should really be a voluntary decision. So where does Centre Alliance sit? Well, at this point in time, we will not be supporting this legislation. We would support a continued extension of the trial in the 4 trial sites. However, this really would be the government's last chance. The government needs to put in the rehabilitation facilities that are promised in Ceduna, that it needs to have those in all 4 trial sites, and it needs to provide comprehensive educational opportunities. No person living in Ceduna should jump on the local TAFE course site and see that there is not a single course available. There is no chance for them without skills to get into employment. That would be disheartening. And if a person does have an addiction, knowing that they can't access services, again, is just not fair. We need to ensure that those services are put in place in all 4 trial sites if we want to ensure that that we give every opportunity to a person who's living in those 4 sites. Also, I think the government needs to invest in some longitudinal data. I would possibly suggest the Hervey Bay region, seeing that has not had any of the research undertaken at that site. And I think what we need to look at is, is this card really working? We just don't know. It's a vibe at the moment. We just don't have the detail. We need to know whether the card is reducing family violence, whether it is reducing alcohol and substance misuse, and whether it's actually doing, I think, what the goal is of the card, and that is supporting people to transition from welfare into employment. At this time, we don't have the evidence, and so we can't support this legislation. Thank you.